Chapter 11. Legal and Illegal Electors. For the 1876 presidential election, each state is required by law to submit their electoral certificates to Washington by December 6 for Congress to count. Democratic Governor L.F. Grover of Oregon is seated behind his huge colonial-style desk signing papers. His assistant, seated a few feet away, is holding a copy of the U.S. Constitution in his hands. Looking up from his paperwork and eyeing his assistant, the governor asks, "Please read aloud the 12th Amendment." 1804, the assistant begins, "The electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for president and vice president, one of whom, at least, shall not be an inhabitant of the same state with themselves. They shall name in their ballots the person voted for as president, and in distinct ballots the person voted for as vice president, and they shall make distinct lists of all persons voted for as president, and of all persons voted for as vice president, and of the number of votes for each, which lists they shall sign, certify, and transmit sealed to the seat of the government of the United States, directed to the President of the Senate. The President of the Senate shall in presence of the Senate and House of Representatives open all the certificates and the votes shall then be counted. The person having the greatest number of votes for President, shall be the President if such number be a majority of the whole number of the electors appointed, and if no person have such a majority, then from the persons having the highest numbers not exceeding 3 on the list of those voted for as President, the House of Representatives shall choose immediately, by ballot, the President." At this point the assistant pauses for a moment when he hears Secretary of State Stephen Chadwick, who is also a Democrat, enter the room. Again, Grover looks up from the paperwork before him and waves a hello to the secretary. "Mr. Secretary, good day to you." He then motions for him to sit in a chair close to his desk. "Come on in and take a seat." Trying to keep the interruption to a minimum, the secretary quickly walks to a chair across from the large desk and sits. Little does either the governor or Secretary of State realize at the time, that in a few short months, Grover will resign his office and that Chadwick will be sworn in as the new governor of Oregon. Grover then looks back to his assistant. "Please continue." Clearing his throat, Grover's assistant starts again. "But in choosing the president, the votes shall be taken by states, the representation from each state having 1 vote. A quorum for this purpose shall consist of a member or members from 2/3 of the states, and a majority of all the states shall be necessary to a choice. And if the House of Representatives shall not choose a president whenever the right of choice shall devolve upon them, before the 4th day of March next following, then the vice president shall act as president, as in the case of the death or other constitutional disability of the president. The person having the greatest number of votes as vice president, shall be the vice president, if such number be a majority of the whole number of electors appointed, and if no person have a majority, then from the 2 highest numbers on the list, the Senate shall choose the vice president. A quorum for the purpose shall consist of 2/3 of the whole number of senators and a majority of the whole number shall be necessary to a choice. But no person constitutionally ineligible to the office of president shall be eligible to that of vice president of the United States." The assistant stops reading and asks, "Would you like me to continue?" Taking a moment to think, the governor answers, "No, there is nothing in there that will help me change the popular result. Hayes has won our state by 100,000 votes, Chadwick complains." The governor settles back in his chair, removes his reading glasses and tosses them on top of the paperwork on his desk. Looking up at the ceiling, he begins to rub the weariness from his eyes and states, "My only recourse to save this election for the party is to use the law in Article 2 and disqualify Watts. It will give Tilden the 1 electoral he needs to claim victory." Chadwick promptly adds, "It clearly states, no senator or representative, or person holding an office of trust or profit under the United States, shall be appointed an elector." He pauses for a moment, thinking then says, "This may just work." A day later, the Republicans get word that Governor Grover is going to disqualify the Republican elector J.W. Watts because of his postmaster position. They decide to counter his decision with more confusion and deceit. They are not about to let the governor and his lot hand over the one electoral vote needed for a Tilden victory without a fight. Waiting in the hallway outside the governor's office are the Oregon Republican electors J.W. Watts, John Cartwright, William Odell, John Miller, and John Parker. Across the hall are Democrat E.A. Cronin and Secretary of State Chadwick. The Secretary of State makes the first move and walks up to the governor's door that is slightly ajar. He knocks first, then peeks his head inside the door and asks, "May I come in?" The governor is seated behind his desk. The argument and dispute that he has been expecting is about to begin. "Of course, I've been waiting all morning." Chadwick enters the office and walks to Grover's desk. Keeping his voice low, he says, "Odell and Cartwright have brought 2 witnesses, sir, along with Mr. Watts." Though he's been expecting a negative reaction by the Republicans over his decision to disqualify Watts, Grover feels his blood pressure rising. Slightly surprising even himself, he states loud enough for everyone to hear, "This dispute has been settled." "Are they here to argue?" "They claim they are not," Chadwick responds, keeping his own voice in an even tone. Not expecting this response, Grover becomes a bit calmer and somewhat confused. "Okay," he reluctantly agrees, a puzzled look now crossing his face. "Fine, show them in." Chadwick walks back to the door and motions to the men in the hallway. As they all enter the room, the governor stands from his chair to greet them. "Good afternoon, gentlemen." He then picks up the 3 electoral certificates from his desk and hands 2 of them off to Odell and Cartwright. These are signed and ready. The Republican electors take the 2 certificates from him and begin to review them. As they are doing so, the governor walks over to E.A. Cronin and hands him the 3rd certificate. "This one is yours, it's signed and ready." Cronin takes the certificate and thanks the governor. The governor now walks back behind his desk and seats himself in his chair, waiting to hear the complaints and arguments that he knows the Republicans Watts, Cartwright, and Odell are going to make. He figures, why wait for them to start the fight, and says, "The electors' certificates have been authorized with my signature. Complete and express them to Congress for the count by the 6th of December as required by law." Odell, who is angered by the switch, knows that the governor has the law of the Constitution on his side, but asks just for the sake of argument, "And where is Mr. Watts' certificate?" "We have been through this all before," the governor answers. Cartwright then jumps into the dispute. Pointing at Mr. Watts, he declares, "We stand firm that Mr. Watts is here as an official Republican elector." "He is not official," Grover interrupts. "Mr. Watts forfeited his right as an elector when he delayed his resignation as postmaster at Lafayette. As a result of that delay, Mr. Cronin here will fill the vacancy. He has received the highest amount of votes required by law to appoint him, by Secretary of State Chadwick here, as the new elector." Odell refuses to accept the decision. "But Mr. Watts has resigned his postmaster's position." Not giving Odell a chance to continue, Grover interjects, "He did so a day after the law required it. The Constitution clearly states that no elector can hold an official federal office." "But Governor, Mr. Cronin is a Democrat," Cartwright complains. "He will vote the certificate as a Democrat for Tilden." Grover, noting how Cartwright almost spat the words "Democrat" and "Tilden," sits forward in his chair and steely looks back to Cartwright. "Mr. Cronin may vote as he deems fit. If it is for Tilden," he pauses slightly for effect, then raises an eyebrow and continues, "then it shall be for Tilden." Sitting back in his chair again, he waves his hand. "Now gentlemen, if you please, I have other matters to attend to." This discussion is now closed and not open for any further debate. Angered by the governor's nonchalant attitude, Odell shouts out, "Governor Grover, we hereby officially object to this decision, on the grounds that you yourself are a Democrat. We also want it noted that you want to use this opportunity to hand Tilden the election." Grover, annoyed by the outburst and accusation, narrows his eyes at Odell. Keeping his voice steady, he sternly counters, "Are you challenging my authority, Mr. Odell?" Trying to make his point, he starts tapping with his index finger on his desk. I have followed the law in this case and I am doing my sworn duty as the governor of this state. I suggest you do the same as an elector. Good day. All 6 electors, hearing the governor's dismissal and realizing that there is nothing more to gain, leave the room without further argument. Once in the corridor, they walk toward another room in the Capitol building and enter. The room has a few empty desks and several chairs. Mr. Cronin walks over to one of the desks with his electoral certificate, seats himself in a chair and begins to fill out the document. The 5 Republicans, Parker, Miller, Watts, Odell and Cartwright stand close by and watch him. After a moment, Odell interrupts, "Mr. Cronin." Without looking up and continuing his task, Cronin answers, "What is it?" "Cartwright and I are declaring our positions vacant and are appointing Mr. Parker and Mr. Miller to replace us." Surprised by the announcement, Cronin stops writing, looks up at Odell and says, "That is not a legal option." "It is and we shall do so," Cartwright adds defiantly. He then takes the 2 certificates from Odell and hands them to Parker and Miller. "Mr. Parker, Mr. Miller. Mr. Odell and I declare that you are to fill our vacancies as the Republican Oregon electors. Please complete these certificates and give them to Mr. Cronin to express to Washington immediately." Miller and Parker take the certificates, walk to another empty desk in the room, seat themselves and begin to fill out the electoral certificates. Cartwright, Odell and Watts walk out of the room back into the corridor. Cronin stands up from the desk from which he was seated behind and walks over to Parker and Miller. As Cronin waits for the men to complete their forms, Miller says without looking up, "Mr. Parker and I will be finished momentarily." Cronin, obviously angered by the switch, "This is illegal and you 2 know it." Parker nonchalantly responds, "It's as legal as the governor appointing you to replace Mr. Watts." Meanwhile, Cartwright, Odell and Watts have already left the building. They enter a small restaurant where a few people are dining. The 3 men walk to a table and quietly seat themselves. Cartwright reaches into his jacket pocket and pulls out 3 new sets of electoral certificates. He hands one each to Watts and Odell and quietly says, "Mr. Watts, here is your certificate. Mr. Odell and I are declaring your vacancy filled. Complete this certificate as a true and official Oregon elector for the Republican Party." Odell turns to Cartwright and says, "I'll wire Chairman Chandler of our actions." Immediately, Cartwright replies. Odell nods in agreement and Watts asks, "What about Cronin?" Cartwright smirks and says, "No need to worry about Cronin. By the time he explains what we've conspired to the governor, our second set of certificates will be on their way to Washington." Then he turns to Odell and says, "Be sure to send the $5,000 back to Tilden's nephew Pelton untouched. His bribe should justify our actions in appointing Watts. I'm betting Mr. Tilden will not be pleased when he discovers his nephew's attempt to pay us off," Odell answers with a chuckle. Back in Governor Grover's office, Cronin enters with his certificate in hand and walks over to the governor's desk. Secretary Chadwick is still present and is surprised by Cronin's sudden entry. Grover asks, "Is there a problem, Mr. Cronin?" Without hesitation, Cronin begins to explain. Odell and Cartwright just declared their positions vacant. It's why they brought Parker and Miller, so they could secretly anoint them electors and give them their certificates from you. I believe these men are planning to send a second set of electoral certificates from Oregon to Washington. Grover stands and pounds his hand on his desk. They are not authorized to do that. He turns to Secretary Chadwick. "Send a wire immediately to Mr. Pelton in New York. Tell him the certificates have been granted accordingly, and that the third elector is a Democrat, filling the vacancy of Republican Postmaster Watts." The secretary takes a piece of paper from Grover's desk and writes down the message. Grover waits for him to finish and instructs, "And wire back the money that Mr. Pelton sent for the Republican electors and me. Let him know that the governor of Oregon need not be paid to uphold the law." Grover waits again for Secretary Chadwick to finish scribbling the instructions and then adds, "As for the actions of the others, inform Mr. Pelton there may be an illegal second set of electoral certificates headed to Congress. Tell him that I am not party to that action. Nor can I stop the Republicans from violating federal election laws." Chadwick completes his notes and confesses to Grover, "I can send back only half of the money." Grover angrily questions, "Only half?" Chadwell explains, "Odell took $5,000 of it for expenses." Governor Grover tightens his fists in anger, knowing there's nothing he can do about the theft of the money.